Patch 6.4 of Final Fantasy XIV brought with it 5 new duty support dungeons. These duty support dungeons, alongside the trust dungeons, are essentially Square Enix's way of making it so that you will always have a group for content, 4-player usually, or more in the future hopefully. This 4-player content is all main storyline related and is essentially to bridge the gap between sections of the game that people might not queue for regularly in the future, or maybe already have less queue numbers. This doesn't include, as I said, things beyond 4-player content that much, apart from a couple of notable exceptions we can't mention for spoiler reasons, but they are attempting to do the entire game over with these NPC AI, if you want to call it that, although they are not AI, they are essentially scripted NPCs. A lot of these NPCs are related to the actual storyline related to that dungeon, which is even more interesting and gives you a whole new reason to do those dungeons again with the duty support or trust system rather than with players. Although that seems to be the only advantage, as the dungeon runs will take much longer because, the output of these NPCs is not going to be as high as other players, and so on and so forth. The loot, however, does remain all your own if you were to get something. So if the last boss dropped a minion, for example, in a particular dungeon, if it dropped, it would be guaranteed yours. The NPCs do not steal your loot. This system has gone on for a while now, and the goal, as we said, was for Square Enix to cover the entirety of the MSQ across the entire game. Now with Shadowbringers they added the trust system, but before that they wanted to bridge the gap with the duty support system, which is kind of like an evaluation sort of, it's an evolution more of the old squadron mission system as well as the trust system. It's kind of like the two together. And essentially in this patch, they've added 5 new dungeons. That includes the Siren Song Sea, Bardam's Metal, Doma Castle, Castrum Urbania, and Alamigo. This is essentially running from level 61, 65, 67, 69, and then also level 70, with Alamigo being the last dungeon in Stormblood's MSQ before the patch content. They do plan, and in fact in 6.5, as you can see in the game, which is greyed out at the moment, in patch 6.5 releasing late October 2023, they are adding the Drowned City of Scala, the Burn, and the Gimlet Dark, which I'm all the hype for. Those will be the last dungeons needed to be added to this system to essentially do the entire MSQ 4-player scene with NPCs rather than players, which has its advantages and, as we've already talked about, disadvantages. So let's talk about these particular dungeons. They had to do quite a few things significantly to change them to make them work for NPCs. Bear in mind, mechanics designed around players do not work with NPCs all the time. Things that are overly complicated have to be simplified. But first of all, you might be wondering what exactly the setup is, depending on what you queue as. So let's start with Siren Song Sea, the level 61 entry to Stormblood. In Siren Song Sea, if you play as a tank, any tank in a game, you will actually get Lys, Alice, and Alphino as your group, which is pretty awesome. Those are all obviously main storyline NPCs. If you play as a healer or a DPS, you actually don't get that setup. You get a generic Carvelane tank, which is obviously less ideal. A lot of the extra dialogue in the background between these NPCs, you will miss out actually on little sections, little speech bubbles, little extra bits if you don't play as a tank. So my recommendation would be to get the most out of this and to see the most of those interactions, albeit they are minute and there aren't many of them, would be to play as a tank. The same can be said for Bardam's Metal. If you play as a DPS, you actually get Gosetsu, a Mole Youth Healer, and Lord Hien as the other DPS. However, if you play as a healer, you actually get Gosetsu, Hien, and Lys, which is pretty awesome. And if you play as a tank, you get the random Mole Youth Healer, Lord Hien, and Lys. So playing as a healer in Bardam's Metal actually gets you the most NPC interactions. Again, like we say, these are minor and shouldn't be any major deal breaker, but if you do want to see extra speech bubbles from those NPCs, that would be my recommendation, to play as healer. For Doma Castle, if you play as a tank, you actually get a random Doman Shaman NPC as a healer and a Dorman Liberator as a DPS, along with Yugiri, the ninja from the storyline. If you play as a healer or a DPS, though, you actually get Gosetsu as a tank alongside Yugiri, as well as one of those Doman Liberator DPS or a Doman Shaman healer NPC. So anything other than tank actually gets you the most potential side dialogue and extra speech bubbles. For Castrum Urbania then, which of course is the level 69 dungeon, nice, you actually play as DPS or healer, you get Alphino and Alice and a random resistance fighter tank. And if you play as a tank with the same setup, basically, you get the same NPCs. So you can be any role on this one, and it really won't matter that much. It seems to be the one exception to the rule. However, finally, for the 6.4 update in Alamigo, which is the last dungeon, the 4-player dungeon of the base Stormblood expansion, if you play as a tank, you actually get Alphino as a healer, Lys, and Raban as DPS. And if you play as healer here instead, you get Raban and Lys, but instead with Arenvold as the tank. And the same setup actually with Arenvold if you play as DPS. So if you play tank, you will actually get a different set of interactions through your dungeon than if you were to play as healer or DPS. I mean, they're all pretty interesting. So this is a very unique situation, whereas you can change, you know, who you've got, and it will kind of have a different outcome. I'd like to think that Arenvold being involved in this part of the storyline is incredibly important, because this is the first moment where you realize what Arenvold is kind of capable of, but at the same time, having, you know, Raban in the dungeon does also make the most sense because of the resistance fighting. But yeah, definitely try all of those different variations. They are quite unique. Again, like small speech bubbles, nothing too major, but it's interesting nonetheless. In terms of the bosses then, you don't even need to go in the trust system or the duty support system rather to actually see these changes. Basically, the NPC locations within all of these dungeons has been adjusted. That's the first thing to note across the board. So to make things easier for the scripting for the NPCs to path to and things like that, make it easier for them. And then certain mechanics across those bosses as well. 11 bosses, I think, in total was affected. For example, in Bardam's Metal, certain mechanics in the Gorilla boss battle have been adjusted. I mean, a lot of this shouldn't be too out of place. I don't think there's really anything that's been changed for the worse. It's not as if like everything has suddenly been telegraphed when it wasn't previously, like when we had the coin counter example with Aurum Vale. You know, nothing drastic has changed like that. But if things are a little bit simplified across the board in places, but overall, I would like to say that the majority of these dungeons still remains to be faithful. They've been a lot more faithful than they have in the past with these dungeons, and I'm quite pleased with the outcome. Hopefully we get the Drowned City of Scala, the Burn, and Gimlet Dark in a similar way. The one concern I do have for the future is that with the Burn, with the Mist Dragon, how they're going to deal with that fight, especially with you know, the way things are on that, without talking about it too much. But yeah, very interesting across the board, but minor adjustments, NPC locations, things like that. But the biggest difference is what you queue into those dungeons as, and that's why I thought it was worth talking about. Anyway, let me know what you think about these changes, if you support the duty support system, or if you would rather they not do this. Regardless of the fact, it is happening, and when 6.5 comes out in late October, they will have accomplished their goal. Who knows what that means for the trust and duty support system going forward in the future, whether they backdate some of the other side content additionally to the main content as well. That would actually be quite nice, because I think a lot of the side content is probably, you know, side story content, things that people don't necessarily queue for as much. And personally, I'm a firm believer that it would be nice to get the squadron system in place to the same standard, so that we can have alliance raids, because that would be awesome if you could do some certain old alliance raids that people don't queue for with NPCs. Can you imagine? That would be chaos, and I love that. Anyway, much love, enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.